land, opportunity or obstacle. Last week we had a good presentation by John Eisenhower, Technical Assistance Biologist with the Wildlife Resources Commission, and he is joining us again today. So we look forward to that presentation. Just to recap on the agents that have worked on this program is Kim Woods in Person County, Matthew Place from Warren County, Paul Westfall, and Johnny Coley from Granville, and Paul McKenzie from Vance County. Paul also works Warren County as well, and Johnny works Person also. So thank you all for working and putting this together for everyone to enjoy. We do have 5 more of these, including today, so 4 after today. And we do ask that if you have questions during the meeting today, to put them in the chat, and or hold on to your questions to the end, and we will go through the chat box. The chat, if you are familiar with Zoom, is right at the bottom in the center. Just click on that and you can type your question in. Matthew Place will be from Warren County, will be monitoring that chat, and we'll provide those questions for John after he finishes his presentation. So does any other of the agents have anything to add before we get started? All right, hearing none. John, if you can unmute. I'd like to recognize John again. As I said, he's a technical assistance biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and today's presentation is on invasive plant control and forest management to benefit wildlife. So, John, we learned a lot last week. We look forward to what we learned today. So you got the floor if you want to share the screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am John Eisenhower. I'm Technical Assistance Biologist in the Private Lands Program with the Wildlife Resources Commission. My day-to-day role is out helping folks develop management plans for their property, giving recommendations and suggestions to help them meet their wildlife goals for their property. And we'll have to kind of get started here, similar to we did last week, and talk about the title of the series here, Wildlife Opportunity and Obstacle. And hopefully today, most of you are here because you see wildlife as an opportunity. I think maybe some of the obstacles will be talked about in the next few weeks. But, how do you define what's an obstacle and what's opportunity? It all comes down to who, and that's based on the landowner and the landowner's objectives. That's one of the things that I always harp on, because when you're dealing with private landowners, everybody views their property a little bit differently. Everybody has different needs. And if you don't take that into consideration, you'll really, you'll miss the target trying to help a private landowner. So last week when we were talking about early successional habitat, the main thing that gets people kind of held up with managing early successional habitat are the looks of it, that unkept look. And whenever you start managing habitat in forest situations, the 2 things that most folks have to balance are the monetary value of the timber crop and the intrinsic value that comes along with the other factors. And there again, everybody's a little different, and each landowner has to decide how they're going to balance those 2 factors. Some folks really like the wildlife aspect on their property. Some folks really need or want to produce revenue off their forest land. So all in all, those are the 2 things that most folks have the most challenging time balancing in forest management situations. And of course, every forest has an inherent wildlife value. Critters use trees no matter what the situation, no matter if they're managed or not, if they're very open, very little understory like here in this photo. But, we have to think about it. Most parking lots have an intrinsic wildlife value as well. So whenever we start talking about habitat, we have to be a little more specific. And whenever we talk about management, we have to be a little more specific. And it kind of comes down to, do you have an objective? And a lot of folks, whenever I talk with them, they're say their wildlife is their objective, sustainability, responsible management. All these things are things that people say, I want to have this on my property. But as we dig down a little deeper in each one of these things, when we say wildlife, which species? Are you talking about abundance of species? How many of one critter you might see out there? Sustainability. Is it economic sustainability? Is it generating enough income that you can continue to hold on to the property? Or is it ecologic sustainability? Is it that the ecology, the food web, the ecosystem? Two different things depending on how you define sustainability. I want to be a responsible forest landowner. To who or to whom or for what? What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to be responsible for? I want mature forest. Is that biologically mature, meaning that the trees are beginning to die? Or is it financially mature, meaning that they're not producing income anymore, no financial return? Anything that is good has a wide open definition. So what does good mean to that landowner? And of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So looking nice is kind of difficult for us to define without some additional information. And then oftentimes, whenever I go through and try to get folks to define their objectives, especially new landowners or landowners that are forced into a situation through an heir situation or transfer of property through an estate, what would you do if you were me? And that's always a tough question, because without a very well-defined objective, it's really hard to lead folks in the direction they need to go. There again, I'm going to drive objectives home because it's a major point of private lands management. And why are objectives so important? Conveys the landowner's wishes. It identifies the correct professional that should be providing input for their plan. Gives sideboards for that professional to provide guidance. We can look back after the fact and say, hey, is what we prescribed as far as management, did that meet the objective? We can evaluate what we did, can measure the results. Most importantly, we can make sure that we can have landowner satisfaction in their property ownership. And especially when families are involved, oftentimes, if we have a very well-defined objective, we can do away with some family feud. If the family knows why they're managing their property, what the return's going to be, what the input costs are going to be, we can really help everybody understand what's going on so that we don't have inter-family squabbles about the management of property. And also, if you have good objectives, you don't run into these folks as much. Like this guy that says, dang, your trees are dying. I got here just in time to cut them for you. Some folks like this that might say, hey, we're logging right next door and we can get you a great price for your timber. Somebody like this that says, you got to cut your trees before the tax office does whatever the tax office is going to do. Or this young man who might specialize in cutting small tracts and can take care of your small piece of property for you. There again, having objectives, knowing who you need to talk to, who you need to get advice from, will help you better manage your forest no matter what your objectives are. So from the 2016 National Woodland Owner Survey, these are the reasons that people gave and the percentages that people gave of why they owned forest land. And as you can see, depending on how large your screen is, most of the reasons why folks own forest land have very little to do with timber production. So way down here, fourth one from the bottom, forest products such as logs or pulpwood. As you look at the ones that are higher up on the list, there are a lot of intrinsic values that come into play. Wildlife habitat, privacy, beauty, protect nature for recreation. Those are all things that mean different things to different people. So why do most folks own forest land? Intrinsic values. However, whenever you start asking about what a landowner's concerns are, first and foremost is a financial thing, high property taxes. And as you look down that list, a lot of these concerns have to do with financial responsibility, financial liability, or financial loss. So even though people like to own forest land for many reasons, a lot of their concerns do come back to the financial side of things. So we've talked about objectives and why people own land and how we have to kind of get at the root of what you want from your property. We'll move into a little bit of management for wildlife. And before the last session last week, somebody talked about their food plots that they had down at their hunting lease. And, you know, when we start talking about habitat management, wildlife management on private lands, food plots are one of the first things that come up. And it's what a lot of people do. But that's really just serving one component of the habitat needs. Because these pine trees in the background, as soon as you step into those, this is what you see. There's very little cover, very little food, you know, kind of the pine desert that a lot of folks talk about. So whenever we're looking to manage for wildlife, we look at a larger scale than just food plots. You know, we generally talk about food plots in the cotton candy, if you will. It serves a purpose. It increases recreational success, whether that be hunting, whether that be wildlife viewing. It makes us feel good that we're out planting something to help the critters. But looking at it from the overall habitat needs for most animals, food plots do very little. It is something that helps us with our recreational ventures and makes us feel like we're doing some good for the wildlife out there. To have the most for wildlife species, we need to look at managing in the stands. What we can do to improve the understory and the species composition of a forested stand will have a lot more benefit than anything we could plant in an open field area or fire lines or something like that. And it's not a one-time decision. We can make decisions throughout the timber rotation in the instance of a pine plantation or a pine stand that can promote and improve or impact negatively habitat. So we need to be thinking about different stages of the forest and how we can improve habitat at each one of those stages so that you can pick out the pieces that you want to implement on your property to best meet your habitat objectives. So at the beginning of a stand, whenever we're out trying to establish a stand of pine trees especially, most folks will either use mechanical means, chemical means, a combination of the two, and burning to remove and kill the competition. And it's important that we just apply what is needed. The more varieties of herbicide, the more formulations of herbicide, even some of the surfactants that are used can really impact what survives in a cutover prior to reforestation. A lot of folks want nothing out there so their pine trees get a good jump for the first 2 or 3 years. However, if you have no herbaceous species and very little diversity out there, your wildlife habitat is going to suffer through those first few years of the plantation. Conversely, though, if you're converting a grass field, especially a fescue or Bermuda grass field, to a forest, you need to make sure that you kill all the introduced grasses. Don't just band spray. And here's an example of a field, a pasture that was planted into loblolly pine. It was band sprayed. And, there's very little habitat value there because the fescue and the Bermuda grass are still there. They're beneficials. But then also, if you look adjacent to the trees in this area, there's lots of tall vegetation, and that's a great place for rats and voles to live. And they can actually girdle the trees, killing your trees that have just been planted, or the fescue especially can suppress the growth because of the allelopathic chemicals that the fescue puts out. So it's not best from a habitat standpoint, and it's probably not best from most tree species standpoint either. So if you're converting a pasture to trees, go ahead and kill the whole field. Whenever you plant, there's some steps you can take to improve the habitat through the first part of the young plantation. Reduce your stocking density, planting at a spacing of 10 feet between the trees and 10 feet between the rows or greater. The fewer trees that are out there, the longer it'll be before the canopy closes, and the longer you'll have those herbaceous and native woody vegetation or plants that will help benefit wildlife. Also leave some unplanted gaps around food plots, around access roads. If you plant right up next to your roads, you're going to have to come back in later on and prune those or cut them down anyway. Leave those road edges, maybe some other little gaps in really poor places in your forested area or in the cutover. Let those just come back in fallow vegetation so that they provide some habitat for a few more years after the rest of the stand canopies and closes in. Consider some declining species whenever you reforest. We have a short-leaf pine and a long-leaf pine here. Both of those species grow a little slower than loblolly pine. They canopy in slower, so they shade out the understory a little bit slower, provide a longer period of time where we have some habitat benefit in these young pine plantations. And whenever you put those things together, we can actually have pretty good wildlife habitat for a few years in these pine plantations. We've got good pollinator habitat there with the goldenrod. We've got structure with the broom sedges, some other diverse forbs there. So to maximize the benefit to wildlife in these early young pine plantations, take a few of these steps to improve the species composition there. So once you've got your stand established and you start looking at young stands, we look at a stand like this. Is management needed here? You certainly have a well-stocked stand of trees, and actually two well-stocked. If you think about what the canopy would look like under all these volunteer trees, there's probably somewhere 5,000 trees an acre in this stand currently. So you're going to have no ground cover, no beneficial herbaceous component, and actually all these trees are competing with one another. So even from a timber management standpoint, these trees are going to grow slower. They're going to be more susceptible to disease and insect damage. So consider pre-commercial thinning. This is the same stand after a brush saw crew came through and reduced the stand density to probably 450 to 500 trees an acre. A lot more sunlight on the ground. The herbaceous vegetation is going to respond for a few more years until the trees that were left canopy closed and start to shade out the understory. And plus, you've left your dominant trees in this area. They're going to grow faster. They're going to produce timber and fiber quicker than the trees in the previous slide would. So once you get into that middle-aged stand, mid-rotation release, and oftentimes everybody thinks that wildlife folks are anti-herbicide and anti-cutting trees, and likely neither of those are factual in every situation. But, is wildlife a goal? If you're going to come in and release your pine trees, what do you want to be left in the understory? There again, herbicide formulation, the amount that's put out there, the application method, surfactants, all of these things can impact what the understory looks like. So if we see in this photo, not a lot of herbaceous ground cover coming back into this stand. Part of that's because of herbicide, part of it's because of the thick duff layer or needle layer that's there. And here you can see how application method can really make a big difference. So the backpack sprayer, just like it sounds, a group of folks came through with backpack with herbicide applicators. They came in, they spot sprayed the stuff they didn't want to be growing in that forested stand, left the beneficials alone, compared to the bigger, wider scale herbicide, or excuse me, helicopter sprayed area. The formulation there impacted all the vegetation growing, and really set back a lot of the beneficial herbaceous vegetation. So there again, selecting the proper herbicide application rates, products that you use, surfactants, application methods, all those things can help you to better meet your wildlife objective in your forested stand. Here, for example, this is Arsenal is a common herbicide used to control sweet gums and other hardwood species in pine plantations. It does not impact blackberry briars very much, and it doesn't impact legumes very much. So we've got good cover. There's some food component in this stand, and it was sprayed with a typical forestry rate of Arsenal or imazapyr. Prescribed burn is often thought of as the magic bullet for habitat management in forested stands. And it does a really, really good job of promoting herbaceous vegetation, controlling woody growth, and some other things. But all prescribed burns are not created equally. A hazard reduction burn is controlling the fuel load there. If a wildfire were to escape into this stand, there would be very little fuel there to burn and damage the crop trees or the overstory trees. So that is one goal of most prescribed burns, is reduce the fuel load, reduce the hazard of wildfire. But then this stand, which was burned repeatedly over the last 5 or 6 years, has a really strong improvement in herbaceous and plant species diversity. And anytime you have additional plant diversity, you're going to have additional wildlife diversity and richness. So the cover's there, forage is there, there's seed producing plants in this stand. It has a lot better wildlife benefit than the previous photo of the hazard reduction burn. And it really comes down to stand density. How much sunlight hits the forest floor, directly impacts the growth of the mid-story and the understory. And that's where most terrestrial non-bird species are going to need that cover so that they can benefit from it. From a deer standpoint, if it's out of their reach, it really provides very little benefit to them other than cover. If you take a look at our core sample, this is an example of a core sample that came out of this stand. So they were planted in 1990, and the first thinning happened 17 years later. And this is what the first thinning looked like. They came in and took a row or two, or took a row and then picked a few trees in between the rows. A very typical first thinning in a pine plantation. But then if you take a look at the second thinning, that was just a couple years later. Very short period of time between thinnings here because wildlife habitat was the primary objective for this landowner. You can see between the first and second thinning, very little increase in growth rate. There again, the trees were still fairly crowded. They were still competing with one another for resources. But after this more heavy thinning and a herbicide application, we started to see a bit more growth after the second thinning. So that's good both from a habitat standpoint as well as maintaining forest production component in the stand so that you are still growing some fiber and some timber. And it's important to remember this is not all or nothing. It's a balancing act. And each person is going to balance things just a little bit differently. Some folks that are very much interested in only timber revenue are going to handle things one way. If you're really interested in habitat as your primary objective, you're going to handle things a little bit differently. But there are places and things you can do to have the biggest habitat bang for the buck with having limited impact on timber production. And really, this is the best tool to improve habitat in a pine stand. Whenever you can cut a tree, put it on a truck, and get paid for it, that's the best time to do work in your pine stands. If you have to hire heavy equipment to come in and do work, it gets very costly, lots of soil disturbance. Whereas if you can get paid for the debris, or excuse me, the material that's removed during the harvest, then then it's a net gain. Plus, you're reducing the stand density. You're releasing your dominant trees so that they can continue to grow and produce fiber and timber for you in your stand. So to find this balancing point, or to really have the most bang for the buck with the thinning, and especially with heavier thinning, the more trees you take out, the more sunlight hits the forest floor, the more herbaceous vegetation comes on, and the better the habitat is. So look at these transition zones. Try to target them. We've got a pine stand and a real open hardwood stand here. This edge effect, or this edge between habitat, kind of has the best of both worlds. So you've got some pine component, some hardwood component. Open that up, allow some herbaceous component to come in, and that will further improve wildlife habitat. Linear openings, whether that be shooting lanes, food plots, fire lines, forest roads, access roads, utilize those areas as focal points for your habitat work. On either side of this opening is a great place to go in, reduce the density a little bit, take a few more trees out during a commercial harvest, and let more sunlight in. That's a great travel corridor for wildlife along those linear openings. Along the same lines, daylighting forest roads. This is a primary access road for this landowner. If you have trees that are shading this out, you're going to wind up with more expenses to maintain that, because the water actually, or the road will hold water for a longer period of time. It will decrease accessibility. So daylighting roads does have a financial benefit as well as a habitat benefit, as you can see with the denser, thicker vegetation adjacent to this road. Build off of utility right-of-ways, whether it be a power line like in this photo, or a sewer line or water line right-of-way. You can't grow trees there anyway. Generally, those areas are going to have pretty good early successional habitat, early successional species. The right-of-way company is going to keep that in a 2 to 5 year growth usually. It's going to provide pretty good diversity. And if you don't remove the trees adjacent to that right of way, they're going to cut them for you anyway. So that's a great place to focus your efforts and put forth a little more effort to thin that heavier, possibly use fire adjacent to that power line right away or selective herbicide. There again, if you think about the way that right of ways run across the landscape, very good travel corridors and good diversity along most of those power line right of ways or utility right of ways. And then target logging decks, field edges, food plots, any open space that you can go in and heavily thin or clear cut around will provide a better edge. Oftentimes we call it feathered edges because we're taking the forest back a little bit from the field edge, creating a more brushy, tangly thicket along the edge of these fields, along your food plots. It's just a better habitat that's going to be out in the sunlight for a longer period of time. It's not going to shade out as quickly. It's going to actually improve your field production because you're not going to have those big trees along the edge shading things out, or the root systems really sucking up the water and competing with your crop as well if it's along the edge of a crop field or even a pasture. So we're going to shift from pine plantations and pine forest to hardwood forest a little bit. And, you know, when we think about hardwood forest, a lot of folks really think that that's the highest and best conservation practice that you can have on your property is big mature hardwoods. And you know, certainly they have their place and they do provide a lot of benefit, especially around riparian areas to protect water quality. And you know, in bottomlands like this, the big mature hardwoods were probably there naturally. In the Piedmont, North Carolina, most of the ridge tops and the uplands would have probably been a mixture of pine trees historically because of the fire regime between lightning strikes, naturally occurring fires, and Native American fires. So, you know, hardwoods would have been along the riparian buffers in coves that stayed moist for a longer period of time throughout the year. So hardwoods are very valuable from a conservation standpoint, but when we talk about habitat, we have to remember that habitat quality is always based off of what the species needs. And if you take a look at this diagram, we have everything from very early stages of succession, the grasses and the forbs that we talked about last week, all the way up to oak hickory forest, which would be the dominant forest or the climax forest here in the Piedmont region. And you can see that different species of wildlife, you know, utilize different age classes and different structures of forest. So hardwoods are good for some things, but not necessarily good for things such as quail or bluebirds. Or killdeers. They're back in the parking lots and gravel roads. So we have to think about it from that standpoint. Hardwoods are valuable and very important on the landscape, but it's not the end all be all when we talk about habitat. Habitat's always based on the species and what they need. So when we're managing hardwood forests, we generally try to increase diversity so that you know, the more species of tree, the more species of shrub, the more species of ground cover that you have within an area, the more wildlife species richness you can have. If you only had one or two species of tree that shaded out the entire understory and no understory there, you're going to be limited as the number of wildlife species that can utilize that area. Whereas high diversity of plants generally means high species richness of wildlife. And here again, you can see a few different species and how they, what portion of the forest or what level of the forest they generally are tied to. So lots of folks really want to establish hardwood forest, and get this, a lot of folks want to go out and they have a fresh clear cut that was in pine production, and they want to go out, spray it, and plant hardwoods back. And hardwoods are pretty challenging to plant in a cutover situation, maintain, and to have them come on and actually make a stand of trees, the species that you're looking for. There's lots of things that will volunteer in. So if you are going to manage for hardwoods or plant hardwoods, especially from a production standpoint, make sure that you have a good hardwood site. Planting in a field conversion for riparian buffers, that's a great opportunity to get some hardwoods out on the landscape. It's also something that you can maintain with mowing or other herbicide applications to allow those hardwoods time to get established and start growing before the competition comes in and really starts suppressing their growth. So bottomland sites, deep moist soils, very fertile areas, those are all good sites that would be a good place to look at hardwood regeneration. Sites, mountain coves or Piedmont coves where you have more moisture on the upslopes. Generally see poplar in that area would be another good place to really focus on planting or managing those areas for hardwood species. But even in existing stands of hardwoods, you can perform or implement management practices that can improve the stand structure and composition. And this stand is a kind of a typical, fairly degraded hardwood stand. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But this stand is was on a subsistence farm. So whenever the owner needed some lumber for an outbuilding or needed to generate a little bit of income or revenue, they would come in, they would cut a few trees. Generally, they would cut the best trees and leave the ones that wouldn't make good lumber to grow and reproduce. But there are some things that you can do to impact stand structure and composition in these existing stands of hardwoods. And generally, instead of planting more trees to improve these stands, we generally recommend removing trees. And this is one example of where removal would be beneficial. And you can see our flagged white oak there in the background. When we do crop tree release, we actually remove the competition from around that tree, allowing our crop tree to develop a better canopy. More leaves that a tree makes, the more food it produces, the better it's going to grow. If you're looking at it from a habitat standpoint, it's going to produce more acorns, and the more food it can store and the faster it can grow and the less competition it has. So crop tree release is certainly a way that we can shift the composition of a forest stand as well as the structure. You can see we changed the structure around this tree. We promoted a mass producing tree over some non-mass producing species. Snag creation is another way that we can promote wildlife habitat. This was a little demo tree that we killed. We girdled it, so you've got a band of the inner bark that's removed from this tree. And I think that we also came in and did a little bit of herbicide work, and we drilled some holes into the tree, filled those with concentrated herbicide, and it killed. This is very beneficial to woodpeckers, other cavity nesting species, flying squirrels, screech owls. That tree is a source of insects for bird species. The woodpeckers come in, they use it as a nesting site. They put in a cavity, and that cavity becomes home for lots of other critters as well. So snag creation does improve habitat from that standpoint. But we also, whenever we kill that tree, we open the forest canopy and allow some sunlight to come down to the forest floor. That promotes more ground cover and changes the structure of the forest as well. Sometimes we look at larger openings instead of single trees like the snag creation. This is a canopy gap that was put in to provide a different age class of forest here. So these stumps will sprout, the vines will come in, grow up over this debris, new growth will come in, and it'll be a very important nesting and breeding site for lots of songbirds. Also, the new sprouts will come up. It'll be important from a deer standpoint. It'll provide cover for small mammals. As these trees rot down, amphibians will use those areas as well to hide up underneath the rotting debris. And even though these trees were cut and fell and left laying as a canopy gap, whenever you look at harvesting hardwood forest, you can do small clear cuts. We're actually harvesting the trees in small groups instead of the entire stand, putting them on a truck and generating some revenue. And you're also promoting the next the next forest as the new growth pops up in these forest openings, canopy gaps. And also, whenever you're managing hardwoods, you can use specialized harvest techniques. This area was heavily thinned. We left dominant mass producing trees, which might not make the most financial sense, but it certainly increased the growth of these mass trees. It allowed for more, we mainly left oak trees, so more acorns, and we left black gum, which produces a fruit as well. Anytime that you're managing a timber harvest in a hardwood stand, you want to make sure not to high grade. And high grade, like I mentioned earlier, when a landowner goes out, needs a tree for a specific purpose, wants the biggest and the best, you take it out of the forest, you leave lower quality trees there to grow. That's called high grading. If you're doing a diameter cut, if somebody came in and said, hey, we want to cut every tree 14 inches and larger in size, what is that going to leave you? That's going to leave you smaller trees, suppressed trees, and some species such as maple and beech, things that are shade tolerant, that are growing in the understory. And this type of harvest could leave you with a lower quality stand that doesn't meet your long-term objectives. So managing hardwoods can be very tricky. You want to make sure that when you work with a consultant to do some timber harvest in your hardwood stands, that you certainly get some references, look at some of their sites that they've done this kind of work before, so that you know you're going to get what you want, and also understand what your objectives are. And this was actually this past spring is when we flew and took these photos with the drone. And this was a couple weeks ago. So we have a lot of herbaceous vegetation coming back. You can see the scattered oak trees in the background here. And we do have some woody vegetation coming up. But if you take a look at all these little clipped off ends on this sourwood, the deer have certainly been in here and enjoying the new fresh browse as well. So we've got structure for lots of different species, especially bird species, but we're also increasing the browse component in the understory whenever we open these canopies up, and hardwood stands. So real quickly, we're going to talk a little bit about invasives, and I apologize to Charles because he led the title of this presentation with invasives, and I'm probably going to touch on things a lot less than the title inferred. But invasives, they're not native, they're not from here. Our native species of insects, don't use them for host plants. They outcompete our native species. They can change soil chemistry and make things so our native plants can't grow as well. So really, really a problem on the landscape. And if you take a look, this is actually musk thistle. And this is probably one of the worst cases or infestations of musk thistle I've ever seen. And it just so happened that the landowner I was working with here really wanted to come in and plant some native grasses in this field. And it's really hard to transition into something beneficial whenever you have this kind of competition from non-natives. So that's the impact that invasive species really has. And as far as how to control invasive species, the easiest thing to do is to not establish them to begin with. And here's of course a stand of bamboo, and I did not take this photo. I actually clipped this a little bit ago. And this was the heading of the Craigslist post that I cut this picture from. So bamboo trees, $15 each, or best offer. And I would have to say my best offer would probably not be accepted by this seller on Craigslist. So whether you're buying things at a nursery, whether you're transplanting things even in your backyard or on your property, make sure that you're not introducing non-native invasive species by accident or on purpose. The wildlife community and the soil and water community are guilty of promoting some non-native species: bamboo, Cerisa lespedeza, autumn olive, shrub lespedeza. The best of intentions we've had in the past, but some of these things have come back to really bite us in the butt. And I do apologize, but we're not going to go through a whole lot of individual species and how to control them and what the impacts are. But I did want to at least recommend this publication. And I think that somebody's going to put this link up in the chat portion today. But to me, this is one of the best publications. It's free. You can get a free copy from the Forest Service. You can download it. You can keep it on your smartphone or on your computer. But as far as a booklet that really gets you good identification tips and resources, as well as control of invasive species, this is really a good option, especially for a free publication. I will show you a couple of the pages of some of the things that I find most common in the Piedmont. Autumn olive, again, that's one that was planted with good intentions across the state, across the country. Birds love it. They eat the fruit. It disperses. It provides, or it suppresses and displaces native species. It can be a bad invasive around field edges and such as that.
Hey, John.
But, yes.
Charles, don't mean to interrupt you. Are you showing pictures from that book online?
Yes. Are they not coming up?
You'll have to stop sharing and then reshare that page. Your presentation's still showing.
Okay. How's that?
It's up now.
Okay,
Thank you.
sorry about that. Go back to autumn olive real quick. There's bamboo, and everybody's seen problems with it. Bradford pear is another one of those best of intentions and escapes, and is a widely spread problem, especially in early successional fields. China berry, very similar, not quite as aggressive as the Bradford pear, but still pretty bad. English ivy can suppress native vines and plants. It can actually strangle off and compete with native trees even. Of course, probably the poster child for invasives in the southeast, kudzu. You can see it can have a lot of detrimental impacts. Microstigium or stilt grass is another one that can really take over bottomland areas. It loves disturbance, it loves fire, and it can form mats that can just suppress just about any native species that tries to grow there. One last one, and then we'll take some questions. But mimosa is one of those. It's a beautiful landscape tree. The blooms are very, very pretty. Pollinators will come to the bloom of the mimosa, but there again, they're not native. They can be very aggressive and very invasive in certain situations. So, just to finish up, I appreciate everyone's time today, and hopefully, even though we didn't cover invasives very extensively, we can get you pointed in the direction of that U.S. Forest Service book. And if you have concerns or situations that you would like to talk about more specifically, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. I'll be glad to give you any information that I can to help you with your land management situations or invasive species specifically. And with that, Charles, I think I'm done if anybody's got any questions.
John, we do have one question in the chat box from Charlie Bass. He said, what's the distance, best distance to clear around a tree you're leaving for wildlife?
All right, I'm assuming we're looking, or he's talking about a hardwood tree. And, generally what we talk about is 3 sides free to grow. And so you look at the canopy, and instead of a certain distance, you just make sure that you control or remove the remove the trees that are crowding that species or that tree you're trying to leave, so that it does have at least 3 sides to grow a fuller canopy, so that it can store more resources and reduce the competition on that tree.
And we had another one from Paul Westfall. And Paul, if you want to turn your mic on, you can. He want to know, do you have any advice about privet? I guess he's talking about how to control privet bush.
Right, and I think I don't remember if I said last week or to a landowner this week while I was in the field, but privet is kind of one of my favorite invasives, but you kill it during the winter time when a lot of the other beneficials are dormant. So from a privet standpoint, I like using triclopyr, or like a 2% solution of triclopyr 3A, a 5% solution of glyphosate, like the 41 or 50% concentrate product. You can treat privet after the native hardwoods, native deciduous trees have gone dormant. Late November, early December is a good time to treat them. And again, in the spring, early March is a good time to go out and treat privet. Larger trees, you can cut them down, treat the stump as soon as you cut them. But expect that it's going to take multiple applications, because as soon as you kill the overstory of privet, it's going to release a lot of the seedlings that are in the understory. So you're going to have to do follow-up for probably 2 to 3 years at least to see good control of privet.
All right, and we have Jen Ellington. If you want to unmute yourself, said they have a question about timber harvesting. So Jen, if you want to, you feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat box. We'll try to get an answer.
Well, I'm going to be harvesting about 40 acres of pine growth, and I want to know if there's a roadmap or maybe a list of best practices that would encourage the current wildlife to bounce back as quick as possible.
Okay, and what county are you in?
Granville County.
Granville County. Certainly, the best management practices that are available on the Forest Service website, State Forest Service website, those primarily protect the existing resources. If you're going to clear cut that timber, you're going to get a very quick flush of herbaceous and woody vegetation coming back. And I think what you have to decide is how clean do you want that next stand of trees to be? Do you want your site prep to really be intensive, where you're really knocking back all the broadleaf component, all the hardwood component, to give your pine trees that you're going to plant back the best opportunity to get established? Or are you willing to leave a few things there that might provide some competition for your hardwood trees, or excuse me, for your pine trees or your next rotation of timber? One thing to make sure that you do explain to the forestry consultant or whoever's helping you with develop your reforestation plan is, hey, I'm willing to give up a little bit of establishment success to maintain some plant diversity. So that can shift the herbicide applications. It could be leaving some areas inside that cutover unsprayed, so that you have more diversity on the ground instead of just rows of pine trees in the next few years.
John, this is Charles. I've got a question. And we get this often, and you might be able to answer it, you might not, you might be referred to someone else, but when you're using these herbicides to control some of these invasive species, woody invasives within the forest, if you apply some to a tree that you don't want to die, to the bark of it, will there be any concerns there of damage to that tree? Can that herbicide enter that tree through the bark?
Some formulations can. One that is very commonly used in forested situations is imazapyr. That's the trade name is Arsenal or Chopper. It's actually soil active, so it doesn't even have to get on the bark. It can just be brought up through the root system, or brought into the root system through the soil. So you certainly do need to make sure on that situation. There's some herbicides. Milestone is one trade name that's does a very good job on wisteria and some of the other legumes that you can coat the entire bark of a tree and not hurt the tree as long as it doesn't get on the foliage, and it's really good and effective at controlling the wisteria. So I would recommend that going to the herbicide handbook, or working with a licensed herbicide applicator. As far as something getting on the bark, triclopyr is one that's commonly used for basal bark application. That's where you have to have a penetrant oil that you spray around the entire tree, it absorbs into the bark. But as far as just spraying without the penetrant oil, it generally does not harm the tree just by getting on the bark. But there again, you want to make sure that you have enough information that you answer those questions before you would go out and apply to your forest stand. Everything's a little bit different. Each one's a little different, Charles.
All right. Thank you. Well, not seeing any other questions in the chat. If you do have one, type it in. I did include, John, that the link you sent to the a management guide for invasive plants in southern forests. So that link is in the chat for those that would like that link.
All right.
Do we have any other questions? All right.
And just real quickly, if there's any way I can help anyone with guidance on their wildlife management objectives, feel free to get in touch with me at your convenience.
John, we do have a question just popped up from Carl. She said, how hard is it to find someone to take timber without taking it off?
It's really going to depend on acreage, quality of what's there, local timber markets. There's lots of different factors that come into play. If it's a sizable acreage, always would recommend working with a consulting forester that works off a percentage of the timber sale and works as the landowner's agent. The guys that come around and say, hey, let me cut your timber for you. Or like all the examples I kind of showed to begin with, your trees are dying, you better do something right now. Shy away from that kind of operation. Get somebody that's representing you, that knows the timber market, knows the folks that will do a good job and can move the products that you have. And it really does come down to if the market's not there, or your objectives for your property. This is especially important with the aesthetics of a property. If it's not conducive with timber harvest, then you might want to look at some other methods of management, because it generally, even a thinning and even a selective harvest can look bad for a while. And if that's your backyard and you're going to have to look at it for the next 4 or 5 years before it recuperates and jumps back up, you're not going to wind up being happy with the results. So make sure you get the right input from the right professionals and really look at what options are available to you.
All right. Paul Westfall added to the chat there, Carol, if you see that most of your local forest rangers, the Forest Service in each county has a list of harvesters, be it large or small. But there are some around that will do those small acreages. I know we have some here in Franklin County that will do that. All right.
And Charles, Paul McKenzie here, if I could add a comment on that. At 5 acres, if your objective is improving the stand and wildlife and aesthetics, then under 5 acres, that's something potentially that a landowner could do some work themselves just with a chainsaw, creating some snags, doing some fell and leave work. So that's feasible, or maybe some firewood harvest, something like that.
All right. Thank you, Paul. All right. All right. Seeing no other questions, John, we thank you for joining us again today. A lot of good information shared last week and this week. Hopefully some of you took some notes or found some tips that'd be very helpful. Want to remind everyone that next week's topic is hunting leases and trespass laws. We do get a lot of questions about that as well, so that'll be a good topic. The one following that will be coyote and vulture depredation issues, and beaver management and control, and reducing crop damage from deer. We'll be wrapping up on October 9th. So make sure you have those on your calendar. Again, John, we thank you for joining us today and sharing this information. And you see his information there in the bottom if anybody needs to reach out to him. Does anybody else have anything to add today before we depart?
We thank you, John, for being with us today. It was a good job.
Thank you for the opportunity. I hope y'all have a good weekend.
All right. With that, then we hope to see you next week, next Friday at 1. Everybody have a great weekend.